Hello everybody, my name is Rachel and welcome to my channel, Colonnati. Today I'm continuing my series of wrap-ups for all the things that I read over the past 4 or 5 months. Today I'm going to talk about everything I read in March, and since there are like 14 or 15 things to get through, let's get started. First up is one of the more memorable things that I've read so far this year. It is Trouble with Lichen by John Wyndham. This is my 4th novel by Wyndham and I continue to really like his stuff. I don't really agree with the description of his work as like cozy sci-fi catastrophes or whatever. I think it was like Brian Aldiss that called them that. I do like the feel of his books. They're definitely very 50s, 60s England, quieter catastrophes, but they're not exactly cozy. This particular one, Trouble with Lichen, was really interesting to me. It's got some positives but also some negatives, I guess. So Trouble with Lichen is basically about a woman who discovers a very powerful and interesting property of a particular lichen, and it has massive implications for human life and society, basically. So the entire novel is about the social implications of this thing that she has discovered, though somebody else has also independently discovered it. So who has the rights to this particular discovery? But also it's like, why would she choose to even introduce this thing into society given what it might do? And her reasons are interesting. I think the number one thing about this book that I appreciated, but which is also tied in with some of the negatives, is that this is a science fiction novel from the 1960s written by a man that centers a female character. Not just that, but a female scientist and businesswoman. And her motives are very much about helping other women because of the way that they are shoehorned into particular roles in society, or what they are told to care about, like their age and their appearance and getting married and having kids and stuff. So I wouldn't say that this is a feminist story. It doesn't have those overt tones to it, but the fact that like a male author from this time even thought to write about this, to bring up some of these issues, was really interesting to me. However, it goes hand in hand with the issue of how the female protagonist is portrayed. Like there's a lot of emphasis on describing the way that she looks and how attractive she is and how well she dresses. And I don't actually think you can throw this out the window entirely, because the way that she presents herself is part of her character, it's part of her personality, it's part of her charisma and how she behaves as a business person. Like it's actually important to what she's doing. But then it leads into a super awkward, like romantic relationship with an older man who was formerly her boss, and I thought that that was super weird, especially because like the story literally kills off the man's wife so that she can be involved with him. And I was like, why would you do that? This woman does not need to be in any sort of romantic relationship for this story to work. So anyway, it was a very interesting story. At a certain point, I could tell where it was going to go, and I don't particularly like the ending. There was kind of this twist, shocking thing that happened, and then the actual ending to the book completely negates that, and I was a bit disappointed because I thought the story had just like gone there, and then it turned out it was just a big fake out. But whatever. It was still a really interesting story, and I will continue reading more by John Wyndham. Next up, I read The Narrow Road to the Deep North by Matsuo Basho. I may have just gotten his name wrong and I apologize. This is an older translation of what's basically a collection of travelogues. The Narrow Road to the Deep North is one of the more famous of the travelogues. And my basic memory of this is that Basho was a very famous poet who wrote haiku. hundreds of years ago, and he went on several journeys around Japan at a time when you didn't just travel for pleasure, and he wrote these like sketches and travelogues documenting his trips and the people he met along the way and the poetry that they shared with each other. I thought it was really interesting that the majority of this collection is not actually poetry. There are haiku interspersed with it, but most of it is like prose and description of travels. And even the poetry, I would say that very few of the actual poems are by Basho, because he is meeting people and they are coming up with haiku together. He's sharing the entire group's creations and what other people wrote or said as well. So it was just a really interesting read. I have never read anything like this before, and to read something that's basically a travelogue from a different culture from a very long time ago is, yeah, like, I did not know what I was getting into with this, and it turned out to be very interesting. I would love to read more of Basho's actual poetry, because I think out of everything in this, I enjoyed the haiku the most. Some of them are really amazing. And thank you, I think, to Kim, who recommended this to me. Kim always has very good recommendations for me when it comes to like translated poetry. Speaking of which, I finally read The Book of Images by Rainer Maria Rilke, though I have to say that now that I've read a couple of poetry collections by Rilke, I'm not sure if he is a poet that really works for me. I like his essays a ton, but I feel like maybe 1 in 20 of his poems actually get me or have a line that sticks in my head. So most of The Book of Images, I just read them and was like, okay, I read that. I don't think I'm gonna come back to this. And I was a little bit disappointed in that feeling. And then I would find like one poem that was just like, oh, this is good. So I don't know. I'll probably continue trying to read more by Rilke, but I kind of wonder if there's anything else by him along the lines of Letters to a Young Poet, which I really enjoyed. Now for something completely different. I reread Monstress Volume 5, and then I read the newer one, Volume 6. This was kind of challenging to read. When I reread Volume 5, it was I think in early March, and it was only a couple of weeks after Russia had invaded Ukraine. And if you don't know, Volume 5 is entirely about characters sitting in a city waiting to be invaded and killed. It is the early days of a horrible, horrible war, and there are a lot of atrocities committed in this, like civilians being killed and children, and it's really heavy. It was heavy the first time that I read it, but when I was rereading it in March, it just had one of those like surreal moments where I just realized that what I was reading was probably a very accurate depiction of something that was actually happening on that very day in a real place in the world, and it was crushing. I found it really difficult to read this. And then I paused and actually didn't read Volume 6 until a couple of weeks later. I just needed that break. The series is very good, but it is about a horrible war with no good solution. So the artwork is beautiful. I feel like the storytelling has gotten better. There's been a bit more action and movement with the plot, and with characters finally making decisions and doing things and choosing the path that they want to take. There are also some more twists, like in Volume 6, 2 major characters finally meet again. They've been separated for all of the current day events in the series so far, and then they meet again and shocking things happen. And I really need Volume 7 now. So an excellent series and a challenging one as well. Another comic I read is Are You Listening by Tillie Walden. I read On a Sunbeam years ago when that got big, and I really enjoyed Walden's artwork. Her use of color, especially for panoramic views and just landscapes and stuff, really, really impressed me. I feel like Walden kind of specializes in coming of age stories. Both the things I've read by her, including Are You Listening, feel like they're on that cusp between being a teenager and being an adult and struggling with your place in the world, your relationships, sexuality, that sort of thing. And Are You Listening is along those same lines. It follows a young woman who has realized that she is queer, she's been sexually assaulted by a family member, and she is running away from home. She ends up kind of hitching a ride with another woman from her town that she vaguely knows, and they go on like an adventure that very much goes into magical realism territory, in my opinion. It's like fantasy, but yeah, more magical realism. And I thought that the twisty-turny, surreal adventure that they go on was really interesting. I felt like it was a bit too vague about the characters and their relationships and what had actually happened. It felt like it was trying to be very metaphorical and figurative, especially through the artwork, when what I really wanted to know was, okay, but in plain words, what happened and what are you going to do about it? And that's just because I tend to be very like straightforward and logical about some of these things. But anyway, I once again really enjoyed the artwork, but I'm not so sure that the actual storyline did much for me. I also think that Walden tends to draw people the same way. Most of the women in her stories are all from the same mold, and I've started to confuse them a little bit in this, so that was a little bit difficult. But anyway, I will probably read more of her work in the future. Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. I listened to this on audiobook, and I will someday have to reread it like with my eyeballs in print. I really loved this. What is there to say about this book that hasn't been said by like a million other people before? There's a reason this is so highly praised and very, very beloved. It is a wise book about appreciating nature and traditions and culture and like trying to sort of live in the world that we exist in right now. That's basically what I took away from it. It's so much more complicated than that, but it's a very wise book that I think will be very beneficial to reread at different times in my life, and there are not a lot of books that I get that feeling from. Here's a strange one. This is going to be a book that I think the experience of reading it was far more interesting than the actual book, even though it was a perfectly fine book. That is The Absolute Book. How many times can I say book in one sentence? So The Absolute Book by Elizabeth Knox? Yeah, Elizabeth Knox. Knox is a New Zealand speculative fiction author, and I've actually read some of her work before. I read her Dream Hunter duology when I was a teenager, and that has really stuck with me. That was such like original fantasy at the time that I read it, and I would love to like try it again and see if it still holds up. But not a lot of her books are published in the US or like outside of New Zealand, as far as I know. And The Absolute Book got a lot of buzz when it was initially brought to US publication. I guess there was some sort of like really glowing review of it from somebody who discovered it before it had been published in the US, and that helped it to get published here. So this has been praised as like the next best thing in contemporary fantasy. And you know, it was all right. I listened to this on audiobook. I'd initially started reading it in print, and I was really taken by the opening chapters. They were very mysterious and interesting, and they bring in this main character who seems kind of unlikable but has reasons for why she did things, and there's like a mystery about how her sister has died and who killed her and why, and then people appearing out of thin air and like fantasy elements. So I was really taken by it. And then I needed an audiobook, so I blitzed through this very long book. It's over 600 pages long on audio in just like a single weekend. I was obsessed with listening to the story. And that being said, after the opening chapters, after the initial premise has been established, I didn't feel like there was anything particularly exciting or climactic about this book. It has like this very monotonous pacing to it, in my opinion, that it flows on past you. And I think it's frustrating that this has some really interesting ideas, especially with how like the fae or other magical things are portrayed in a way that is kind of familiar but also with a twist on it. This should have been very exciting, but by the end of the book I felt like the whole story had been suspiciously vague about the world building, about how magic actually works, the implications of this for like the more mundane world, and then like the characters were way more like wishy-washy than I expected them to be. There are some like really tense moments in the book where people think they are going to die, like they're going to be murdered by a horrible person. And I was just like, okay, can we get past this and like maybe back to trying to figure out who this other mysterious character is? Because I care about that way more than whether you're going to be killed by the high tide, which tells you how much I didn't care about the protagonist. So I don't know. Like I said, the experience of reading this and my reaction to the book is probably more interesting than the actual plot. On the other hand, I think that this kind of fantasy will really work for some people and really won't work for other people, and I'm somewhere in the middle. It was all right, and I don't regret reading it, but I also just don't think this is the next best thing since sliced bread. This is not like the new major classic fantasy novel by any stretch. I wish that it was, but I just don't see it being remembered much over the next couple of years. Moving on, When You Trap a Tiger by Keller. This is a middle grade fantasy novel. I remember nothing of the plot. It was perfectly fine, but I think it was a little bit too young for me. I picked it up because it is one of the more recent Newbery Medal winners, and for a little while there I was interested in trying to catch up on a few of those, so it was fine. I don't care that much. Next is Steeple Volume 2, The Silvery Moon by Allison. So Steeple is Allison's latest comic. He is writing it and doing the artwork for it, and I gather that it's being published on his website and then is being published in print, and I'm buying them when they come out in print. I am a huge fan of Allison's previous comic, Giant Days. It's one of my favorite comics of all time, and it is so solid all the way through. I really like Allison's sense of humor, like the kinds of characters that he creates, the hijinks that they get up to, the relationships with each other. It is just really comfortable and funny to read. I love it. Steeple follows a cast of characters who live, I think, in like a seaside Welsh village where monsters come out of the sea every night. The local vicar or priest or whatever he is spends all of his time fighting the monsters of evil. A woman comes to town who's like the vicar in training, and when she discovers all this going on, she's gonna help him, but then things happen and she actually switches places with the satanic priestess in town. All these people are friends. It's hilarious. The Silvery Moon includes more of like a werewolf storyline as well. I just think it's really funny and I want more. Then I read the second half of Check Please. I think this one is called Sticks and Scones. It's by Ngozi Ukazu, and it is a like queer coming out college hockey story. It follows a young man named Biddy who joins a hockey team in college, and the second volume, the conclusion of the story, is much more about his relationship with his boyfriend and them getting there happily ever after. It is really fun and adorable. I don't care about the hockey. I care nothing about sports and fiction, which is going to be kind of funny when I get to the stuff I read in June because I read hockey romances. But yeah, it was a fun story and it was very like emotional and inspirational, and I enjoyed it a lot. I wonder what Ukazu is going to do next because I'm curious about what her next comic might be. I will definitely read it, even if it's about hockey. This next book, I'm going to feel very bad about being rather harsh towards it, but I just have to be honest. So, A Failure to Communicate by Kaia Sonderby. This book was recommended to me years ago. I can't remember who recommended it to me. It might have been Suzanne. I did a recommendations video on linguistics in science fiction, and some people gave me recommendations of things that I hadn't heard of before, and this book was one of them. So the big nail in the coffin for this book for me, like initially, is that I came into it expecting it to be a story about first contact and linguistics and interspecies communication. The main character that's her job, that's her specialty, is figuring out how to communicate with aliens. It was gonna be fantastic. Instead, the major focus of the book, the major point of the main character's point of view, and the theme of the book overall is really the main character's experience as an autistic person in a universe that has eradicated autism and other similar things from the genome. So she's basically the last autistic person in the universe, and she is struggling in an environment where the whole world, all the people around her, just don't understand the kind of person that she is and what she needs, like what hurts her, what makes her feel better, why she even does her job. And so I feel bad for like really kind of hating on this book, because I think that what the book actually is, a representation of the autistic experience, is actually very worthwhile and valuable. And from looking at other people's reviews of this book, I gather that the people who really, really loved it are the ones who saw themselves in this story. And I think that is worth applauding. That being said, I disliked everything else about this book as well. It's got a lot of like new writer ticks to it. There's just clunky dialogue, clunky description. Parts of the plot are just absolutely ludicrous and rely on characters being incredibly naive and a little bit dumb. And the main character gets into a situation where she like takes a job that everyone says that she is perfect at. She's supposedly the best person at what she does. She's supposed to be super competent, the only person who could possibly help with this particular political situation. And so everybody in the book is telling this very unconfident person that she is the best. And we're in her head, and all we see is that she is nervous and anxious and doesn't think that she can do this job. She's not confident, she doesn't have much self-esteem. And the thing is, she's not actually confident. She's not actually good at her job as far as I can tell. Everyone just says she is, and there is that dissonance between being told something and then realizing that there's absolutely no evidence for it in the story, and I found that highly irritating. I just wanted to scream at the characters sometimes. So this book was so frustrating and so disappointing. It's not the worst thing ever, but I was expecting so much more from it, and I just, yeah, like I said, this is probably the worst disappointment I have read so far this year, and I wish that it had been different. Next up is Wrapped Up in You by Talia Hibbert. This is a Christmas-themed romance novella, and even though Talia Hibbert is probably my favorite romance author, this story did nothing for me. I think it was just really too short. It did not develop the characters very well for me. I didn't really get into their romantic connection, and there were just a lot of other side characters that didn't get enough time to really develop. So yeah, I didn't super love this one. And lastly, ending on a good note, one of my favorite reads of the year so far, this is really funny to me, but it is what it is, The Kaiju Preservation Society by John Scalzi. I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I think Scalzi described it as a pop song. It is meant to be fluff. It is meant to be a feel-good book, and I think he nailed it. Ultimately, I just really enjoyed what Scalzi did with this premise. It is actually about humans trying to conserve kaiju and like get them to breed and like try not to die while you're around them, but yeah. And then somebody threatens the like preservation area and threatens the kaiju, and it's also set during COVID times, which I am leery about. I'm not sure if I'm prepared for the onslaught of fiction that incorporates the pandemic, but I also really liked that part of this. It was just like wish fulfillment. Scalzi just gives his characters what they deserve, and it's like great. So I loved this book. It's probably one of my favorite things I've read by Scalzi in a long time. So 2 thumbs up. I really like this as a standalone, but if Scalzi were to ever write more in this world, I think it would be just as fantastic. So that is it for everything that I read in March. This is a wide variety of stuff now that I think about it. Poetry and nonfiction and science fiction and funny stuff and some really serious stuff as well. So yeah, let me know if you have also read any of these. What were your thoughts on them? Who else has read the Kaiju Preservation Society and laughed their heads off? I'll be back to talk to you again soon about more things I read, and until then, bye.